thank you to my colleagues for accepting my invitation here today. So this event is organized by EAST, which is our research center on East Asia at the ULB, with the support of the Maison des Sciences Humaines. I want to thank my colleagues and EAST members for being here today and helping with the logistics, because without them this conference wouldn't be possible. So we are here today to discuss the massive repression against the Uyghur population in the northwestern part of China, the region called Xinjiang officially. Many of you are probably aware that this region has, over the past few years, taken the appearance of a war zone. And Uyghurs in particular face various forms of surveillance, and possibly up to 1 million of them are currently detained indefinitely in internment camps. The latest reports estimate range as high as 1,200 camps across the region, confining religious and secular, young, old and infirm, poets, musicians, public figures, academics, even university presidents and party cadres. Although China's censors have been expurging evidences of this vast and obviously expanding network of political re-education camps, scholars and journalists from all over the world have not provided enough empirical data that paints a picture of the extent of China's massive infringement on human rights in Xinjiang, hence the title of the talk today. So China's repression goes even beyond the border of Xinjiang and the border of China. Yeah, that's me. Okay, I'll check that later. The Uyghurs based in Belgium, for instance, or in Europe in general, also face constant threats from the Chinese authorities, forcing them to go home or to stay silent for the sake of their relatives who remain in China. So the cumulative effects of this onslaught of evidence and the condemnation from the UN, the United Nations, forced the Chinese government to move from blanket denial to a public offensive, in which camps are described as free vocational training schools. So today we will listen to 5 internationally renowned scholars, experts of the Uyghur region, to understand and discuss China's brutal crackdown on Uyghurs and its consequences. I'll deal with that, don't worry. Yeah. Good. So each speaker will have about 15 minutes. This is quite short for such a massive issue. But that's all we have. We'll keep the questions for the end. So if you have any pressing question, please write it down or keep it in mind so that you can ask them at the end of the talks. So a very short introduction of each speaker. On my right, Joanna Smith-Finley is senior lecturer in Newcastle University. She has conducted extensive fieldwork in Xinjiang, and she actually was in Xinjiang in August this year. She produced several books and articles on Uyghur cultural identity and Uyghur and Han relations. Sitting next to her, to Joanna, is Rune, an anthropologist based at Pomona College in California, US. His research focuses on ethnic and cultural nationalism, in particular among the Hui and the Uyghurs. Maybe some of you are familiar with his work. Michael Dillon, sitting on my left, is a historian and independent scholar from the UK. His latest monograph deals with Xinjiang, Islam and resistance, and I think I saw a few flyers somewhere presenting the book. Then Thierry Kellner is a co-founder of EAST, so a research center at the ULB, and a lecturer in political science and international relations at the ULB. He wrote extensively on China's foreign policy, China and Central Asia and the Xinjiang region. And finally, Rune Steenberg is an anthropologist and human geographer from the University of Copenhagen, and he specializes in kinship and local Uyghur literature, among other topics. So I won't take much more time, and I will give the microphone to you. And yes.
Yes, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me at the back without the microphone?
Not be difficult.
No. Okay, I normally shout very loudly. First of all, I'd like to thank Vanessa for doing all the organising that's made this conference possible and at such short notice. I offered to give a talk entitled Xinjiang, the background to the current crisis. As you've already heard, I'm a historian, and that means I can't really understand anything unless I work out where it's come from. I have to look at the history, and I'm going to ask you to think about the history today. It seems to me very important to recognise that although the conflict, the crisis in Xinjiang has worsened enormously over the last 2 years, 18 months, 2 years, it is not new, it's not something new. This is a problem that's been growing over the years. The present clampdown isn't something that's come out of the blue entirely, although it sometimes seems like that. It's the latest move by the state to try and control what was going on in I put it down here as an ethno-religious and political struggle. And this struggle between the Uyghurs and the Han states been going on for decades, or in some senses you can say it's been going on for centuries. There's a long history of conflict over territory, control and power. Some recent studies of the conflict in Xinjiang have appeared to suggest that it blew up simply as a result of the spread of Islamic fundamentalism from the Middle East or from Afghanistan, and it's something that is an analysis that the Chinese state has tried to encourage, arguing that their own policies towards Xinjiang have been more or less perfect, but these dreadful foreigners have been exploiting it. What I want to do today is to argue this is not the case at all. This is a long-standing problem, and part of the problem is the old policies, the historical policies of the Chinese state. It's quite difficult in many ways to disentangle the history of Xinjiang from the history of China. Partly, so much of the material is written in Chinese and from a Chinese point of view, but it's salutary to realise that there is a separate Uyghur history, like there is a separate Tibetan history, a separate Mongol history, that these histories are linked in with the history of the great power China. There's no way you can avoid that, but people do have their own historical memories. The Uyghurs have their own historical memories of earlier times when there were Uyghur states or proto-states. If we were to go back into the 15th, 16th century, you can see the beginnings of Islamic caliphates, particularly in Kashgar and Khotan. They were pretty well completely independent of China until the 18th century, when the Manchu Qing Empire expanded into this area. And so what we're seeing now is a colonial hangover from the 18th century expansion of China. And but throughout all this period, there has been settlement by Uyghurs in the area which we now call Xinjiang, and until very, very recently, they were the majority population in that area. A lot of journalistic articles have referred to them as the minority. Well, they're not a minority to themselves. They see themselves as the majority and the original population there. You probably already know, but we must point out that the Uyghurs are of Turkic origin. They arrived in Xinjiang as part of the Great Migration of the Turkish tribes from Mongolia, and they happened to be on the wrong side of the mountains, ended up in China rather than in what was, until fairly recently, Soviet Central Asia. What that means is that they are ethnically linked to a lot of the other Central Asian populations, notably the Uzbeks, and of course some Uzbeks live in China and in Xinjiang, and the Kazakhs and Kyrgyz. So it's important that they have this affinity with the other peoples in Central Asia, and their language and culture are very, very close to that. Now, there is a movement and a demand for independence among some Uyghurs. It's almost impossible to work out how many. It's looking to me as if I'm not going to have time for my slides, but I better catch. I'm going to be stopped, I know, when it's time. I'd just like to point out to you that all the independence demands that some Uyghurs are making are not entirely fictitious. There have been in the past, in the relatively recent past from a historical point of view, various independent Uyghur regimes. Yakub Bey in the 1960s, and then two independent Eastern Turkestan republics in the 1930s and 1940s. They are, I think the important thing to point out about these is that they were able to exist because the Chinese state was very weak at the time. The Chinese state, as we have seen, is not weak now, and so the chances of any sort of independent Uyghur or Muslim Turkic state is almost zero at the moment. Xinjiang was incorporated into the People's Republic of China in 1949 after the liberation, after the Communist Party won the Civil War. There was resistance to this from some Muslim groups in the 1950s, particularly in the south of Xinjiang, the Kashgar-Khotan areas. The PRC's response to this was the creation of an autonomous region. So Xinjiang officially is the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Uyghurs will tell you that there is pretty well no autonomy at all. The institutions of the autonomous region are almost entirely Han dominated. During the Cultural Revolution, when again the Central Chinese state was weakened, the idea of independence occurred again, and it grew in the 1980s. 1991 was an important year because as the Soviet Union fell, the fraternal Turkic Muslim peoples in Central Asia, many of them formed their own independent states. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and there was an argument among the Uyghurs, well, if they can have an independent state, why can't we? And of course the answer was because we were in China and not in former Soviet Central Asia. Some people I don't know whether it happens here, some people in Britain seem to assume that communism has gone in China. It hasn't. The Communist Party has, thank you, the Communist Party rules with as iron a fist as possible. One final date I want to bring to your attention, because I think it's the crucial point in the crisis, and that's 1996. And 1996, it seems to me, is when the present state of emergency that's really began in the northwest of Xinjiang, in the town that the Chinese call Yining and the Uyghurs called Lulja. Demonstrations against the Chinese in 1995 brought down what the Chinese government called a strike hard campaign against them. And in a way, that strike hard campaign has continued. until the present day. It's dramatically intensified since then. But it's in this Strike Hard campaign that we see the beginnings of the current crisis. And just to bring you right up to date, the current crisis coincides with the new administration of Xi Jinping, which came in 2012. Doing something about the Xinjiang problem was part of his thinking from the very beginning. And what really changed was the movement of a man called Chen Qianguo, who had been the party secretary in Tibet, and he'd been in many ways using Tibet as a laboratory for what was then imposed on Xinjiang in a much harsher form. He moved to Xinjiang in 2016, and the result is the securitization, repression, militarization of Xinjiang that we see today. Do I have a few minutes to show some stuff?
You do have a few minutes.
Some?
Do you still want to say
something? Is the time?
Sure.
What I'd like to do is just show a few slides of Kashgar, the Kashgar-Khotan area in 2010, which is the period when the old city was being demolished. And I'll have to go through them very quickly, so just to give you a flavour of the way that people were managing to live and survive and sell fabrics. My wife particularly liked that design, by the way. As the old town was being pulled down around them, and buildings like this one were being erected in what was intended to be a sort of neo-Uyghur style, and there are different opinions on how Uyghur these are. This is where you can see the town being demolished. It was like walking through, it was like walking through some of the First World War or Second World War Blitz photos of London, or the First World War in Europe. It was really odd to see all these places falling down. I think I'll just have to do Kashgar and not the other ones, and stop in a minute. And I believe that there are going to be some more illustrations later on of the way this has changed in 2018. This is the proud house owner who managed to keep her house. There she is, up and running while everything was being demolished around her. Whether she had connections or not, or whether she was just very awkward, she claimed that the reason her house hadn't been demolished was that she kept it properly clean. And the grandchildren were there as well. But all around were these really desperate ruins. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this very important historical perspective. And unfortunately, it seems that these pictures are part of the history now, too. So we are now listening to... Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here, mostly because Vanessa has worked so hard to pull this together and to pull this from various countries and cities around Europe and around the world. I'm going to try to talk quickly as well. I just want to point out that this map, which I purchased in Amsterdam in 1920, says Ust Turkestan, East Turkestan. This is the region that is now named Xinjiang, which means new region. And there's a big debate over the history of this region. The Chinese want to say it's always been part of China. And I tell them, no, we have maps that says it's East Turkestan. There's never been a West Turkestan, at least. And Xinjiang in Chinese means new region. So I tell my Chinese guests, hosts, generally government officials, that if you really want to claim this as always being part of China, you have to change the name. And there is some discussion of that as well. So I'm just going to go very quickly through this. I'm very interested in the region because I believe that it is part of this new Belt and Road Initiative, which I'm sure you've heard about. And it's right in the crossroads or crosshairs of the region. And according to my thinking on this, the reason we have these re-education centers, Chinese call them vocational training centers, is because of the Belt and Road Initiative. That the government does not want to have any problems. The region is critical to Xi Jinping's grand plan to take China global. I have an article about this that I just published, which I will be glad to send you. I'll show you my email address at the end. You please feel free to write to me, and I will send that. But this is a book that a few of us scholars put together in 2004, mainly because there was nothing comprehensive in English at that time about this important region. And I got every one of us that contributed to that volume blacklisted from going to China, and to that region. I have not been back to Xinjiang since 2004 when that book was published. We became known as the Xinjiang 13. There's actually a lot more, it was 16 at least, involved with the book. But basically the point of that book was to show that the history is a rather contentious history. But the book also pointed out, when we argued in 2004, that according to Dillon was right, that this is the pivot of Asia, it's the heart of Asia, and it's once again become critical to China's future development. It was rather backwater, we'll talk about that. But if you're interested in my approach on this, this is an article that just came out, and I can send it to you if you send me an email. But basically arguing that these re-education centers stand in the way, are part of preventing Xinjiang and the Uyghurs from standing in the way of Xi Jinping's grand scheme to take China global. And that's the point of these things. Now, if you're in China, I was just allowed to go back to China, to Shanghai and Beijing and Nanjing recently. I came back a week ago. That's why it was a little challenging to get here. The feeling I got from many of my friends, I've been traveling to the region for over 30 years now, and I saw many of them on my recent trip, was basically that this is good for the region, that they need re-education, it's progressive, it's modern, it's bringing the Uyghurs up to speed, and they've had, as Michael mentioned, they've had problems in the region, but basically they've argued that this is a way to modernize, to improve the Uyghur through education. It's a very Chinese idea, Confucianism. If we have time, we'll talk about Xi Jinping himself. But a different approach is to suggest that, as I tried to in this article, that this really is a effort to control knowledge production. In other words, to bring Chinese knowledge into play in the Uyghur consciousness, and not Islamic knowledge, and not terroristic knowledge or outside extremism, one of the three evils. Can I have that water? I'm going to need it. Thank you. Yeah, that's it. And basically, we've argued in the past that the Chinese government said that these terroristic or violent incidents, civil unrest, were caused by one organization outside of China, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement. Several of us argued that the violence that proliferated, particularly in the first part of 2000, from especially 2009 to 2014, that spread throughout China, not just in Xinjiang, particularly in Yunnan and Kunming, that it was not caused by any one organization. And this idea that there was one organization was really from outside of China. The Uyghur Human Rights Project has documented, as well as the World Uyghur Congress has sent in a lot of information about each of these incidents. You can go through them. Most of them we can see are not organized from the outside. A lot of them are civil unrest. A lot of them are protests, worker protests, or personal vendettas against police who arrested family members or administrations to the government that ended in violence, mostly crackdowns on these communities. The Al-Qaeda have never been active in the region, although it's claimed that they've been active in China. None of the kind of organized hallmarks of Al-Qaeda that unfortunately you yourselves have experienced in Belgium. None of the suicide bombers or the vests or the large, well-planned initiatives. All of these are small scales, knives, etc. So basically the fear of the government now is that Uyghurs who have gone out of China, who have fought in Syria and in the Middle East, who have been trained, will be homegrown terrorists and return to China. As far as we can tell, there's no evidence of this, and indeed the last 2 years since the ratcheting down of the Syrian war, the conflict there, there's been no incidents at all in the region. The Chinese want to argue that the reason there's no incidents of violence the last few years is that the government has policies working, that this strike hard campaign, which I think is now a strike out campaign. They want to remove any hope of this. And we've argued that the problems really have been endemic to Chinese policies themselves that have led to a lot of the conflicts, the violence, and really the biggest policy, and by writing this, being involved with this book, this is what I discovered in my passport. Something you don't want to see if you want to go to China. It's just a little stamp nowhere near your visa that says you've been rejected and denied. And it doesn't necessarily mean you've been put on a blacklist, but it does mean that you're not going back anytime soon. And basically, it was very effective in silencing a generation of scholars and students who were reluctant to work with some of us because we're too radioactive and toxic. Right? And one scholar says she'll never touch the subject of Xinjiang again. But really it's unfortunate because as you can see, the region is critical to this plan. There's a lot of important developments that we scholars who spend our lives learning languages and traveling to the region would like to observe and to write about, and also provide counter narratives to this narrative that the old Silk Roads are being revived and this area is becoming important to the region. This is the map I was hoping to show. Can I? No, we missed it. How do we? That was the one we were playing with. Okay, there we go. Yeah, I knew we were going to have a problem with that. Yeah, oh, okay, we can try it this way. I'm worried about, no, I think we'll give up on this now. Let's go back to this. Yeah, I think basically it shows you that the Chinese dynasties have not been involved in the region. Oops, we lost it all now. Okay. That this region was never really integrated into China until the Great West Development Program under Deng Xiaoping, the first phase of China's development. We're not getting anything now, are we? No, it's frozen.
Is it?
Yeah. So when we look at some of this development campaigns, we know that on the southeast coast under Deng Xiaoping and then under Jiang Zemin, there was an effort to develop internal China, but the western part of China was left out of this program. And now we go, there we go. Okay, and it's really only until Hu Jintao that we had the start of this Great Western Development Program. And why? It's very simple, because in 1993, China became an oil importing nation. And it had to find greater sources of oil, both in the region and also imported. So therefore, the region became critical to what some scholars are calling now a cool war between China and Europe and America for Middle Eastern oil. And so a new great game. But you can see that the region is critical to China's development, not just for domestic sources of energy, but also imported. and therefore they have to expand west, and also for export purposes. So therefore, under Hu Jintao, this policy of inward development, moving out Great West campaign, is now under Xi Jinping, the corridor by which he wishes to move the Belt and Road Initiative, what some scholars are calling an Iron Silk Road. It's a huge initiative involving over 74 countries, as well as here in Europe, and it's also one that is going to touch every corner of the earth, not just Europe, not just East Africa, but also will be critical to China's future. Again, we know that it's a very heavy infrastructure initiative, and therefore the region is critical to the success of this plan. You can see that satellite mapping has shown China's greatest population have been concentrated in the west. Growing up in California, I could not help but see the pattern of development very similar to the westward expansion in the United States, also driven by infrastructure and rail. Kashgar at one point looked a lot like Los Angeles. I think it's starting to look like it again. Without the quest for oil and natural resources, these campaigns would not have been run. And so when you can compare the West with China, you can see the United States with China, you can see some very similar developmental patterns. And also the problem of native peoples, indigenous peoples that stand in the way. We know, all of us know the terrible record of the United States in its westward expansion, and we had hoped that China would avoid those problems with its Soviet-inspired nationalized program. Unfortunately, we're beginning to see that perhaps not. It's making some of the similar mistakes. Mainly because this region, which is known as Xinjiang, that's the Jiang character, basically means border. There's a very important part of this character. It's a nice character because these are the arable areas for agricultural oases, both in the north and south, separated by the mountains, the Tian Shan, the Pamirs, and the Altai Mountains. Here is a bow, gong, and this is land. So using the military to bring the land with this Western Development Campaign. And so now it's the source of this. We know there are a lot of native minority peoples there, Turkic. But this is the key, I think. It's not a problem of Islam or minority identity or ethnicity. It's really a problem of population and demographic shift. Chinese sources themselves have shown that in the beginning, let's see, are we not getting that chart? Oh, I'm sorry, that's not coming up. That in the 1940s, Chinese sources have documented, this is a Chinese source, that the population of Han was only 7%, Uyghurs maybe 80%, and today, in 2014, it's much more, closer to 48% Han. I think you in Europe know the problem of migration, and when you have large numbers of migrants, it's challenging for the state to manage. For China, it's always had a very complicated ethnographic and ethno-linguistic map. Some people say it's more like an empire trying to become a nation state. And these native peoples, these ethnic linguistic groups, have been subjected to Chinese development programs throughout China. This new program of the Silk Road is critical to China's success. Okay, good, perfect, 2 minutes. Wow, that seems like a lot. Been going very fast. We can see that what's important is to control and integrate the region. The past Soviet policies were basically bottom up in a sense of using education and using cadres and government officials to spread the government's message. Now we see that this effort from Harmonia is top down, it's militaristic, it's integrative, and we can see this through studies of militarization, security policies, technological advances in the area. And one of the ways to justify this policy of integration, a huge resources investment, is counterterrorism. And so the Uyghurs are very useful in this policy as scapegoats that have said that as a result of fear of terrorism, they can justify this kind of, that's my stuff, that's my own timer. And the Uyghurs themselves have always argued it's peaceful resistance to these policies. They've never advocated publicly terrorism violence or radical Islam. China has been fighting against separatism mainly in Tibet and Taiwan, but now the Xinjiang has come under this policy, this radical policy of integration. And so I wrote about the attempt of Muslims to protest government efforts in 1989. If you look at that, the date of this protest was basically 10 days before the Tiananmen massacre. At that point, Muslims were allowed to protest and encouraged to do so as a symbol of the government's tolerance towards minorities. And here you can see that we have Uyghurs and we have a Hui Muslim, Chinese Muslim, and I think the Kyrgyz here holding up a government permit to protest. So the government's trying to say, listen, we're just about to launch the Tiananmen crackdown, but we're still a democratic government and you can protest. I wrote about this in my first book. Let me just try to conclude here. Basically, I'm arguing that the region is both a bridge to China's development and expansion of the One Belt, One Road, but it's also a barrier. And China is very much trying to knock down that barrier, both within, with re-education and consciousness, brainwashing, you might want to call it, but also a kind of Confucian-inspired educational effort to make Uyghurs think along the lines that Xi Jinping and the party want them to and fulfill the China dream. And for Chinese, it's really an effort to redress 100 years of humiliation, to stand up in the world. They see this as a peaceful developmental process, but certainly not for the Uyghurs who've been arrested. We'll hear more firsthand accounts of that. And that Xi Jinping is expanding this program. Now, what could be our role in the West? I think having conferences like this to attempt to change the narrative, or at least provide counter views to this narrative, to give voice. Notice there are no Uyghurs on our panel. I think they are subdued and very scared and very nervous and very fearful to talk about this, because not just for them in the West who are under pressure, but for their relatives back home. So consciousness raising, presenting other views, publishing books, as well as writing op-eds, but also I think organization through NGO support and getting the message out, as well as highlighting the more positive elements of Xi Jinping's program, which is investment in a region that has been ignored. And also, he very much has argued that this is to benefit all mankind. In the speech I showed at Davos, he encouraged participation. He encourages Western participation in the One Belt, One Road. The United States has not participated, has not come out against it, but has not supported it either. And I think that's a mistake. I think the U.S. should be involved, to have a voice, to have a seat at the table, but that's certainly not in the mind of our current government, who wants to build walls, not bridges or roads. So I'll conclude with this slide. There's my email. Please feel free to be in contact with me if you want this presentation or the article I mentioned, and to keep in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Indeed, it's difficult to invite Uyghur colleagues. Rune, could you? Very few of them want to stand up and speak up, but one of them wanted to come today, but she was invited in Washington, actually, so she couldn't make it today.
No. It's on. I'm just using this for my notes.
Yeah, okay. It's coming back. Sorry, my mistake.
Okay, maybe. Oh, yeah, there it is. Okay, great. So, thank you very much for coming, everyone. This is an issue and a topic that is very dear to me personally, also. And this has two reasons. One is because I've spent a lot of time in Xinjiang, and I have a lot of friends who are now interned in these camps, and to whom I have no contact any longer and haven't had it for about a year and a half, because any kind of contact with me would put them in danger. The second reason is that before focusing on Xinjiang, and also afterwards actually, I've also spent a lot of time in other parts of China, and China is very dear to me. I have a lot of Han Chinese friends, and I'm actually quite saddened by the development things have taken. When I started looking into China and also looking into Xinjiang, this wasn't at all what I had in mind to be talking about. I would much rather talk about something else. So we here see China and Xinjiang on maps from the Xinhua bookstore, and as you see, the maps are in Uyghur. And this is quite a good demonstration of the side of China's Xinjiang policy that is often overlooked and not much talked about. There has been a thriving publishing industry in Uyghur in vernacular language, much more than we're used to seeing in other countries in minority languages. And there's been an extreme support by the Chinese government of this publication, of the development also of an Uyghur intellectual culture in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. When I was living in Xinjiang for about a year and a half between 2010 and 2014, there was, besides this thriving intellectual scene in Uyghur with a lot of publications, also commercial publications. This is something that came up in the 2000s and really made the book market, the Uyghur book market, explode. And there was also a thriving discussion on religion and morality, something that now cannot exist or take place anymore, but that we're also not used to hearing about. So all of my friends in Kashgar, they discussed reform Islam, so more textually based Islam coming in from the Middle East and Central Asia, and they didn't all have the same attitude towards it, but they were not afraid of discussing it. They thought it was very important, and morality generally, be it Islamic or traditionally based or a modern kind of either Chinese or socialist or Western morality, were very big topics during this time, because Xinjiang was undergoing very, very big changes and a very big transformation. In 1999, the Chinese government implemented the so-called Develop the West strategy that Drew already alluded to, and this meant a lot of investment into Xinjiang and a lot of money going in, but also a lot of change in the economic structure as a result of that, including the dispossession of a huge amount of people and the destruction of traditional livelihoods for a huge amount of people, who were then channeled into the big cities. The usual modernization picture that we are used to seeing all over the world, with all its problems and also its benefits in a way. And this triggered a recalibration of Uyghur thought, of Uyghur attitudes, and it did trigger a turn towards more religiosity, not necessarily as fundamentalism or extremism, but often as piousness and a way to make sense and make meaning out of your life in a situation where things are changing towards a more modernized, more capitalist, more exploitative society, and you as an Uyghur are on the bottom of this development, because that was clear. While Xinjiang was developing economically, the Uyghurs were not the ones profiting mainly. A lot of Han Chinese, we've seen the migrants coming in, but more important than the migrants, who are often low-skilled labor coming in, we had business elites from Eastern China also coming in and taking over a lot of the structure, both politically and economically. So within this environment, also arose a lot of dissatisfaction and a lot of protests of different kinds. Now, I was in Xinjiang between 2010 and 14 doing research on my PhD thesis, which was on marriage and weddings, something that seems quite unpolitical, and at the time I did it, it also was relatively unproblematic to do. I never had problems with the secret police. I never had anyone come to bother me, and I spent a lot of time with Uyghur scholars working on Uyghur customs and traditions. I partly co-taught some courses in Urumqi. Of course, there were things you couldn't talk about, and at this time already there were people disappearing, there were people being taken out, but it was on a fairly small scale. And my studies were fairly successful also in cooperating with Uyghur scholars. This changed in 2014. In 2014, the Chinese government dropped their policy of setting the economic agenda on top and changed it to putting a security agenda over the economic agenda. We already heard a few reasons why that was. I won't get into this in detail, but the official explanation was that it was to counter Islamic terrorism and separatism. There are a lot of other developments that are behind this also, and we might get into this partly. But the effect it had was a slow securitization of the region, and the restriction of a lot of areas, surveillance of a lot of areas that hadn't been surveilled before. For me personally, it meant that I had to tread much more carefully. It also meant that I could no longer do field work the same way I had done before. So I switched my focus. And I stopped doing fieldwork on the ground and instead started looking at the Uyghur intellectuals' productions of books. As I said, at this time it was thriving, and especially Uyghur publications on their own customs and their own traditions. And so I developed a research project to look into this. And I discussed it with Uyghur intellectuals in Xinjiang, and they were very enthusiastic, also because this felt like a safe area. It felt like a spot where we could talk about things. Maybe I couldn't go do field work, but maybe some of their students could do it, and then collect some data and compare it with how the culture is depicted. And it felt like something we could do without getting anyone in trouble. This was in 2015. Now, in the last 3 years, this has changed immensely. And my colleagues with whom I discussed and developed this project, almost all of them, these are some of the books that I'm using and that were used, published. Almost all of them are now either in prison or in re-education camps. And this is the development that has taken place in the last 2 years. Michael is of course right in saying it has a much longer history, and if we want to look into the ups and downs, the meandering, we have the Cultural Revolution and the Radical Decades, and then we have the 80s with a very open policy, and now again things are tightening. So I'm not saying it's a new development in this sense, but the way it looks now has developed within the last, especially since 2016, when Chen Chunguo, the former party secretary of the autonomous region of Tibet, became the party secretary of the autonomous region of Xinjiang, so the Uyghur autonomous region, and especially also in the last year when the prison camp, or so-called re-education camp, changed through education policies were instated. This is one of the early camps. This is a very small one. You see the barbed wire on the top. You see Xi Jinping's picture on the front of it. Some of the bigger camps hold 10,000s of inmates, all interned extrajudicially, that is, without any kind of trial, on the basis often of the social credit scoring system that has been implemented in Xinjiang, where depending on if you pray, if you go to the mosque, how old you are. If you're a man between 17 and 40, you get a lower score, which ethnicity you are, and so on. You're given a certain credit score, and this marks you as either safe or not safe, trustworthy or not trustworthy. And if you're marked as not trustworthy, you don't have to break the law in order to be sent to a camp like this. And many of my acquaintances and of my friends' relatives have been sent to these camps, also just for having a relative abroad and communicating with a relative abroad, that is, getting phone calls from their siblings. I've heard in Urumqi some people are allowed to get phone calls from their direct relatives, that is their children, but not from their siblings or their cousins or anything like that. This will mark you down in this credit score, and it will result in you having a much greater chance of going to these camps. In the jargon of the Chinese government, well, first they denied the existence, and now they have changed to calling them vocational training centers, and there have been videos shown of how people are receiving education there in a very civilized manner. There are high doubts as to whether these are not just staged videos, but we have very little information on these camps, and I can't go into details about it now, but basically the information we do have, and we have them from people who have fled Xinjiang, who have been in the camps and come out, and we also have it from satellite images and from research on Chinese government websites, where a lot of these constructions that have been going on, and some of the 29 of these camps were identified by an Australian research institute, and they were said to have expanded by 2 million square meters in the last year. And all of this is, of course, constructed by companies, and the calls for biddings for these construction things are going up online on the Chinese government website. So there is quite a bit of information that is actually secured and that we can take from these websites. So what happened to... How much do you have? Okay, 2 minutes. So basically, what happened to my colleagues is that the things they would, and also a lot of my friends on 2 different levels, practices that were deemed culture have switched to be deemed religious, and that is fundamentalist sometimes, or political, and that is separatist. And people who have been looking and writing about these things are thus also getting in trouble, because the practices that they were portraying as harmless culture, and there was a big discussion about this. In the 80s, the Chinese government was supporting public readings of the Quran. Today, if you have a Quran at home and it's found out, you're probably going into a camp. So things have shifted and changed, and things that were practiced as normal cultural practice, including the religious wedding ceremony, the ritual of nikah, of reading the first surah, the Fatiha of the Quran for the nikah, was a very normal practice. It was seen as culture. Then it became seen as religion in 2014, and it was restricted so that only the imam of the Friday mosque could now read the nikah. And now in large places it's become fundamentalist. It's become to be seen as extremist, basically. And there's been a lot of shifts. We can take a lot of examples. Also the dance of Sama, which originally was a Sufi dance, then became part of the whole tourist industry display of trying to sell especially Kashgar as a tourist destination, and later then also became seen as religious, was removed from the public space, and now it's also seen as fundamentalist. There are a lot of examples of this shift of practices and the redefinition of what culture, or what is culture, what is political, what is religious. Now my point in this, and my main point, is that these intellectuals whose works I'm now reading and who now sit in these camps. They were Uyghurs. They were also proud Chinese citizens. And they believed in a lot of what we can call propaganda that was put out in the sense of modernizing, developing. They believed in being part of a modern Chinese society. They were very much opposed to the turn towards piousness, towards religiosity, and they wrote about this and they published about this. And some of it, of course, they published because of the censorship. They phrased it in a certain way, but there are a lot of books that were published as private memoirs, and they're out of their own initiative that are very positive towards a lot of the developments that have taken place in Xinjiang and in China generally. They can be seen as bridge builders between traditional, if we want to call it so, in shorthand, Uyghur society, that is, people who are based in the rural areas, who are not well integrated into the formal systems of economy and bureaucracy, and on the other hand, the Chinese state and the development of a Chinese economy, of a modern Chinese economy and society in Xinjiang. They were bridge builders between these places. For a lot of different reasons, their role as bridge builders ended. And they're now in camps, and the publication of Uyghur books has all but halted, except for something like these, which are propaganda pieces being put out by also Uyghurs are, implicated in it, but not authored by anyone in particular. You can see they only have an editor, not an author, when you look at them. And these are some of the books that I'm looking at right now. But the era of Uyghur publications that started in the 80s with government support, took off in the 2000s as it became commercialized, and was really thriving along with discourses on religion and morality in the early 2010s, have been brutally, I have to say, cut short. And I think this is extremely sad, and I think it didn't have to be like that. And I think and hope, because most of these people are still alive. There have been some deaths in these camps, but they're not extermination camps, and they can come back out. The question is, what do they come back out to? And what kind of attitudes do they come back out with after having experienced a lot of both abuse and indoctrination, pressure in these camps? I think, yes, I'm going to stop now. I think there is hope to turn this around somehow, and both for my bleeding Uyghur side of the heart and also for my bleeding Chinese side of the heart, I do hope that we will come to some kind of solution that changes things in a positive direction. Thank you very much.
So Rune has talked a bit about the camps themselves. I'm sure you've all read quite a lot about the internment camps in the media recently. I'd like to talk about the effects of the internment camps on those Uyghurs who are not yet in the camps. So this presentation is based on my field trip to Xinjiang from June-July this year. I spent 2 weeks in Urumqi and a week in Kashgar. During this trip, really, I witnessed the most abject fear and trauma that I've ever seen in the region. I've been researching Uyghur communities for 27 years, and I've been going to Xinjiang over the last 23 years, and I've never seen this level of fear previously. The mosques are deserted, except for the PRC flag, which is everywhere. The mosques are cloaked in razor wire. Restaurants are stripped of their halal signage, so the halal signage has been scrubbed out or torn off, or simply the facade of the restaurants have been replaced and the halal signage has gone. And local people are absolutely terrified, almost silent, and always carefully avoiding any expression of religious piety. So all but 2 of the contacts I've maintained for 20 plus years were too petrified to see me, and of course I did not pursue that because I didn't want to endanger them. So the signs of this fear beginning were already there back in September 2016. This was my previous trip to India. This was when Gore, the regional party secretary, had just arrived. He'd just been transferred in from Tibet. Having tamed Tibet, he was now asked to tame Xinjiang. And one of my friends, respondents, I had some very striking interactions with her. I met her first in a public restaurant, and then we went back to her home. And during the whole of our conversation, she repeatedly declared to me, with a straight face, how great Chinese state policies were in Xinjiang. That would have been fine, but having known her for 20-something years, I knew that previously her political position was not particularly approving of Chinese state policy. So the next time I met her, it was a bit different. Her husband drove us out of the Rune. He drove us into a mountainous area. We walked up a deserted mountain track, abandoned the car, because the car also may have GPS satellite technology listening in on our conversations. She walked us up a mountain track, and then she spoke directly. And she said, I have much in my heart I want to say, but I can't say any of it. Well, I can say it, but no one can hear it. And if the government's policies are really fine, then why am I so afraid of speaking about them? Okay. And then went on to criticize the policies. So the conversations I had in Urumqi and Kashgar this summer, really the fear of the internment camps has led to an environment of almost near silence, petrified silence. A Chinese taxi driver, for instance, in Urumqi said to me that detained people are just there to have their thinking changed. You know, in a very Orwellian sort of idea to transform their minds. And the Uyghur people I spoke to, these are snatched conversations, opportunistic conversations, spoken under the breath, away from CCTV cameras, out of sight of cameras, out of reach of police box audio surveillance. So a Uyghur lady in Kashgar said to me, next to no one is coming out of these camps. The only people coming out are those people who fall ill. What was meant by falling ill? Well, sometimes falling physically ill, but also other respondents were telling me that some people have been given psychiatric medicine to change their thinking and to prevent them, to stop them from believing in Islam, to stop them thinking about Islam. And the atmosphere is such fear, that the teachers told me, we used to chat a lot, we Uyghurs. But now we don't talk anymore. We're so afraid of saying the wrong thing. At one particularly striking moment, I was with a very long-term friend. She agreed to meet for 20 minutes only. She wouldn't sit with me in any given place. She would only walk around the streets with me so that we could not be continuously observed in any one position. And I talked to her very quietly under my breath about what concerned scholars such as ourselves are doing outside of Xinjiang to try to publicise the situation. And I asked her whether she had thoughts about the potential for genocide. And in the middle of this conversation, this was between police boxes, we talked about innocent things when we got to a police box, and then when we got between police boxes, we came back to this topic. But in between, she noticed that I was looking very, very serious, as one would when talking about genocide. And she suddenly said, don't look so serious. Everybody is paying attention to everybody else now. In other words, all of the Uyghurs around us are potential spies. All of the Uyghurs around us are watching everything we do, and then they report back on what we are saying. Smile. So we're walking along, and I'm smiling, and I'm talking about genocide with an enormous smile on my face. It's quite the strangest moment I've ever had in a while. So, no one is going in the mosque. The mosques are securitized. This is what a mosque entrance looks like now. I had various conversations with the men who were monitoring the gates of the mosques. They said, we want to go in the mosque, but if I go in the mosque, they will take me to prison or to one of these internment camps. They check our identity cards with these machines. They use iris recognition technology. The businessmen who used to go in the mosque don't go in anymore, they're too scared. The retired men won't go in the mosque because if the retired men go in, the state will cut their retirement benefit. Okay, so financial disincentives. State employees can't go in because if they go in, they could lose their job, they could get a sack. Okay, so various financial disincentives. I spoke to some long-term American residents in Urumqi. They've been living in Urumqi for about 30 years. And they describe it like this: fear is maintained by constantly moving the goalposts, or making policy pronouncements so vague and so broad that people don't readily understand which activities are included in the prohibitions. And so to be safe, people end up self-censoring, and they self-censor to extremes, just to make sure that they can't get in any kind of trouble. Okay. So this is Kashgar, this is the Haidkar, the ancient Haidkar mosque. The Arabic calligraphy has been torn off the top of the gate there. You can see where it's been torn off. Instead, we have two Han Chinese riot policemen inside with riot shields and a Uyghur lady dressed in traditional clothing selling tickets to tourists. So the only people going in this mosque currently are Han Chinese tourists and foreign tourists. Compare this with my previous visit to Kashgar, which had been in 1996. When you would see 10,000 Uyghur men going in this mosque on a Friday lunchtime. Now it looks like a museum. So this is from my field notes. A ticket seller, 45 yuan entry, that's about £4.50, yeah, probably about €4.5. A ticket seller and two riot police with riot shields are sitting inside the entrance. I expressed surprise that tourists were allowed in, and I asked whether people are allowed in to pray. The police immediately become threatening, demanding to know my business. Inside it's like a ghostly museum and historical site. There's nobody praying. Across the front wall of the far prayer hall there are banners reading, "Ethnic unity is happiness, spiritism and riots and calamity." Young Uyghur men in traditional embroidered shirts with their heads uncovered, this is very unusual in the mosque of course, not normally allowed, usher Han and foreign tourists into the rear prayer hall. I asked one what he thinks of tourists entering the prayer hall. He briefly shakes his head and says, "This is just my job. I wouldn't know about that. I'm local." And as I walk away, he gets out his phone and apparently informs the riot police on the front door that there's a troublemaker in the area. When I approach an older Uyghur man watering plants in the courtyard, he moves away, gradually, meter by meter, and then he resolutely shakes his head when I say hello to him. Seconds later, a police officer appears at about 8 meters and hangs around, and he waits there, staring at me until I move away. So then I moved to Kashgar Old Town, refurbished Old Town. What you find in Kashgar Old Town is that the neighbourhood mosques have, some of them have been desanctified, they have the crescents removed, they are all padlocked shut, no one is going in them. If you ask where has the crescent gone, the residents are too afraid to answer because of audio surveillance, because of the cameras. So you have to ask them questions. So, has the crescent been taken away? And they will nod silently. They won't say the words. And everybody routinely confirmed that the mosques have been closed for over a year now. When I asked how do you feel about that, they were too afraid to answer. They would just say things like, "I'm sorry, I can't talk about that. I have to think about keeping my job." So I met a German undergraduate student when I was in Kashgar, and she then went on to Guljar. I didn't go to Guljar myself, this is in North India. She went up there and we kept in touch by Signal, which is an encrypted messaging service. And she wrote back to tell me that people in Guljar were also very reluctant even to say where the mosque was. We don't have any mosques, some people said. Other people said, then she found 2 mosques, but both have been closed for over a year. And by the way, this timing of the closure coincides exactly with the release of the de-extremification regulations in April 2017, so the religious de-extremification laws. And the presence of these 2 mosques had been removed 6 months earlier and was still removed from these mosques. A Kazakh woman in Guljar told this student that her father used to pray in secret, but now he's so scared of the consequences that he won't even pray in his home. He's too scared. This is what the anti-halal campaign looks like. Everywhere in Urumqi there's a gentrification program going on where the facades of and shops are being torn off. And when the new signs are put up, the halal signage has vanished. Okay, so I have many pictures of Uyghur restaurants where the halal signage has been ripped off. But the Uyghur restaurants, I think this happened before I got there this summer. I think it had already happened. Because what we're seeing on the Uyghur restaurant signs is brand new signs with no halal signage. And if you ask the owners why no halal signage, they say, oh, we didn't put it in the design plan. So it indicates deliberate self-censorship on the part of those owners. I asked a Uyghur restaurant earlier, and she, how do you feel about the halal sign about it being about to disappear in this gentrification? And she said, well, our halal sign will not be replaced in the shop, it's this new front. But even if it doesn't appear up there, I'll still have it in my heart. So another young Uyghur woman working in a cheap store. I had a very good conversation with. We removed ourselves to a part of the shop where there were no CCTV cameras, where we couldn't be filmed or heard. And then she talked to me and she said, we don't have any festivals now. We have no Uyghur festivals. So the Islamic festivals essentially are outlawed. No one even dares to say Assalamu alaikum anymore. You know, the peace be with you, the Arabic greeting. It's too religious. As you walk around Kashgar all the time, you will see these Baohu notices. Okay, this is the allocation of Chinese communist cadres to households. They give the name of the community cadre, a contact number, and the table underneath there shows the residency situation of every house in that immediate community. So the name of the household, male head of household, and how many people in each house. And this really heightens the sense of surveillance. You know, everybody knows who lives where, everybody knows who's doing what, and it's very easy to report your neighbours to the community cadre. This was a very horrible day, very horrible afternoon. A white man and a Uyghur woman, husband and wife. I'm talking to them near this mosque. It's another desanctified mosque. You see the crescent missing. The second picture on the right there is an Islamic school. That had been closed for much longer, apparently, several years. The man said the mosque had been closed for some time, the Konekt school many years more, and they were both very upset. He said to me the other day some foreign Muslims came walking around here and they wanted to go in the mosque to pray. But I had to tell them to go to the Haidkar Mosque. I told him about the Haidkar Mosque and his wife literally dissolved into tears when I told her about that. She asked me what I did. I said I was a university teacher, and almost immediately she realised, she cottoned on that I would know what the situation was there, and she just wept. She stood there and wept and squeezed my hand. And it was a really horrible moment. And she asked me, when will things get better? I said, well, everything changes, nothing lasts forever. But she didn't seem able to believe that things could change for the better. We've all heard about the controls on religious dress and facial hair. You've read about these in the news. My German student I met spoke to a Uyghur taxi driver in Bozar, and she just said to him, the mosque situation here is so sad right now. And hearing this, he immediately started crying. And he got a picture of himself now with a moustache, which would be the sort of norm of masculinity for a Uyghur man, and said, today it's not possible to grow one. It's not officially forbidden, but everybody knows the consequences of growing one. So there's a psychological impact there on the men. And this is reflected on the faces of the children. Here is this little man, this little Uyghur guy in Kashgar. He's 6 years old. He has always received all of his education in Chinese. Right? He sat there and he sang for me, unrequested, the entire China national song in perfect Chinese. I have a video of it. If anyone wants to see it, email me and I'll send it to you. And he loves learning Chinese. But at the same time, he's very conflicted. He recreates on his face the beard, the Uyghur cultural norm, using white sticky labels. You know, and I posted this image on Twitter at the time and said, you know, perhaps this is the only beard this man's ever going to have. It's really quite bitter out there. And then we see self-censorship among musicians. So this is the Grand Bozar. And these are two teenage boys who play the guitar, the two-string flute, very absolutely beautifully, and they are there with their teacher. And we are talking about a certain musician. Can you just flick to the next one, Vanessa? Just briefly. Right, we're talking about this musician. This is one of the disappeared. This is one of the people who are disappeared in the internment camp. He's probably the most famous, certainly the most accomplished guitar player in Xinjiang. And back again, please. Sorry, two back. Sorry. Thank you. So they were playing songs by this man, this disappeared man, and their teacher suddenly said to them, "Don't sing the words. Just play the tune. Don't sing the words." These Han Chinese, they don't understand our language. They translate our language, they get the meanings wrong. They misinterpret the meanings, and then people end up in the internment camps. Next. Thank you. And finally, just a last word on the Han. The Han are not enjoying any of this very much either, the Han Chinese. People in Urumqi told me, I heard from lots of people in Urumqi that around 15 or 16% of Han Chinese with Urumqi registration, household registration, have actually left Xinjiang for good and moved back to China proper over the last year. And again, this corresponds with a very, very heavy securitization regime. And some of these Han officials, particularly those who work for the government, are being pulled into this net of distrust, and being asked to write self-criticisms about themselves, and for a while they were also asked to write self-criticisms about their Han colleagues, although that's been stopped again. But again, a very sort of cultural revolution-esque term. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. So our last talk will be in French by Thierry Kellner.
Bonjour à tous. Alors on va changer un peu de langue, j'espère que ça va peut-être un peu vous réveiller parce que c'est lourd comme question. Alors moi j'ai préparé une petite présentation que je dois essayer de faire en 10 minutes, donc on va voir si ça fonctionne. L'idée principale en fait c'est que la campagne de répression finalement auquel on assiste aujourd'hui au Xinjiang et dont sont particulièrement victimes donc les Uyghurs, mais il n'y a pas que, parce qu'on n'a pas parlé des Kazakhs, on n'a pas parlé des Kirghizes, mais il y a toute une série de musulmans entre guillemets qui eux aussi sont victimes donc, de ces mesures. C'est le dernier avatar finalement d'une politique de sécurisation, un processus donc au long cours dont on peut retracer finalement les étapes dans l'histoire récente de la République populaire de Chine à partir de la fin de la décennie 80 et du début des années 90. Et qui aboutit aujourd'hui à la mise en place, je dirais, pratiquement de la dernière étape, donc c'est-à-dire cette société d'hypersurveillance qui, in fine, donc, favorise une assimilation pure et simple, voire la disparition de cette minorité ethnique, donc Uyghur, avec tous les exemples que nous avons eus jusqu'à présent. Alors, j'avais divisé donc cet exposé en 3 parties. Je vais aller très rapidement donc sur la seconde, parce que c'était la plus longue. D'abord, vous savez, depuis que vous êtes dans cette salle, vous entendez beaucoup parler de sécurisation. Je vais vous expliquer un petit peu ce que c'est, parce que c'est un concept politique et il faut savoir de quoi on parle. Ce sera le premier point. Le deuxième point, c'est que je vais vous donner simplement quelques repères chronologiques pour vous permettre de vous orienter dans la politique que la Chine a mis en place, donc dès la fin des années 80 et le début des années 90, en m'arrêtant un petit peu sur les contextes. Parce que les contextes nous fournissent parfois des explications de la politique ou nous expliquent comment le pouvoir en Chine a pu utiliser ces contextes pour accélérer son processus de sécurisation. Et nous terminerons par la situation actuelle, donc rapidement, qui à mon avis est une impasse. C'est une impasse, c'est un dilemme d'insécurité, avec une fuite en avant sécuritaire, donc vers une société d'hypersurveillance au service de l'assimilation pure et simple des Uyghurs. Alors, qu'est-ce que la sécurisation? Donc, c'est un concept qui nous vient de l'école de Copenhagen, donc dans Relations internationales. Pour faire très simple, la sécurisation demande 3 étapes. La première étape, c'est que vous construisez un discours de la menace. Vous avez une autorité légitime qui mettent en place un discours consistant à dire voilà, nous avons un problème et ce problème est une menace. C'est une menace qui est existentielle, qui pèse sur la sécurité, par exemple, de la nation. Alors ici, dans le cas qui nous occupe, nous avons l'État, donc l'État parti communiste et ses relais, donc notamment les relais provinciaux du Xinjiang, qui ont construit finalement donc, cette menace ouïghour par une répétition du langage, donc d'actes de langage, où on a assimilé d'abord les Ouïghours à des séparatistes, et puis de plus en plus à des radicaux, et dans un dernier temps à des terroristes en fait. C'est ce discours-là, cette progression-là, à laquelle nous avons assisté. Le fait de parler et d'associer sans arrêt donc, la minorité ouïghour au terrorisme, en fait, vous créez vous-même la menace par le langage. C'est un acte de langage qui crée. Donc, qu'en dire, c'est faire, en fait. Donc, cette menace vient d'existence ou est actualisée par votre discours. Parallèlement à ça, évidemment, quand vous avez une menace que vous créez vous-même par votre discours, vous prenez des mesures de contrôle et de répression. Alors là, il y a tout un volet sécuritaire qui est mis en place, donc aussi bien au niveau législatif qu'au niveau des mesures de contrôle, de répression. Vous en avez vu ici quelques exemples sur les photos. Il y a vraiment tout un éventail qui est déployé aussi au niveau de la propagande, dans les médias, etc. On arrive au troisième mouvement, enfin au troisième moment pour avoir une sécurisation réussie. Il faut qu'il y ait une acceptation de ce discours. Il faut que l'audience à laquelle vous vous adressez accepte ce discours. En ce qui concerne la question du Xinjiang, on voit aujourd'hui que ce discours est accepté en grande partie par l'audience interne, puisqu'on a, enfin, je vous expliquerai, vous allez voir, il y a pas mal de choses que l'on peut attribuer, donc en tout cas une forme d'acceptation de ce discours en interne en Chine, mais aussi en partie à l'international, parce qu'il y a énormément d'États, etc., qui sont sur la même longueur d'onde en disant oui, tout à fait, on fait de la lutte contre le terrorisme, etc., etc. Donc ça, ce sont les trois moments les plus importants. On construit le discours, on prend des mesures et ce discours est accepté par l'audience. Alors, ça permet de passer au deuxième point, donc la chronologie de ce processus de sécurisation. Donc, je ne vais pas entrer dans tous les détails, surtout pas de l'éventail de toutes les mesures qui ont été prises au Xinjiang depuis la fin des années 80, le début des années 90, avec des périodes d'accélération, etc. Donc, toutes ces mesures ont été étudiées par des ONG, par Amnesty International, par Human Rights Watch, par Human Rights in China, par un certain nombre de personnes que vous avez ici dans la salle qui travaillent sur le Xinjiang depuis de nombreuses années. Vous allez retrouver tout ça. Ce qui m'intéresse, c'est de vous montrer qu'en fait, on a un processus de sécurisation qui démarre en fait très tôt. Dès 1989, dès 1990, on a un incident qui s'appelle l'incident de Bozar, qui était une petite bourgade aux alentours de Kashgar. Et dès ce moment-là, donc là on est en 1990, dès 1990, vous allez avoir la construction d'un discours liant donc les Ouïghours à des menaces comme le séparatisme, comme le radicalisme islamique, des choses comme ça, parce qu'on est dans un contexte qui est particulier. Et ce contexte de la fin des années 80 et du début des années 90, comme l'a rappelé justement Rune et certains autres de nos orateurs, c'est un moment où la Chine est vulnérable, c'est après 1989, après Tiananmen, elle est un peu isolée. La Chine a aussi un exemple juste à côté de chez elle d'une défaite d'un État communiste face au djihad, aux djihadistes en Afghanistan. En 88, les troupes soviétiques se sont retirées. On a le bloc de l'Est qui commence tout doucement à s'effondrer. En 1991, on aura la fin de l'Union soviétique et on a des républiques d'Asie centrale qui naissent aux frontières même du Xinjiang. Donc tout ça vous donne un contexte dans lequel on a un sentiment peut-être de vulnérabilité de la part des autorités qui, de manière, à mon avis, préventive, vont prendre des mesures de sécurité, vont sécuriser le Xinjiang. En luttant, soi-disant, contre le séparatisme et aussi contre les activités religieuses. Parce que très rapidement, les deux sont associés. Donc, ce qui est culturellement ouïghour et les activités religieuses sont tout à fait liés rapidement. Donc, à partir de ces années-là, on a des appels à combattre le séparatisme, etc., dans le discours qui est récurrent au Xinjiang. Aussi bien de la part des autorités du Xinjiang que de la part des autorités centrales. Si on avance un petit peu dans les années 90, dès 1996, la Chine va essayer de transférer son discours à l'international à travers la création du groupe de Shanghai. Parce que dans la création du groupe de Shanghai, il y a tout un volet sécuritaire dans lequel apparaissent déjà ce qui s'appelle les trois fléaux, c'est-à-dire le séparatisme, le fondamentalisme religieux et le terrorisme. Alors, chacun de ces mots va être mis en avant selon les époques. Après 2001, il est évident que le terrorisme va devenir le point de focalisation principal. Alors, 1997, c'est un événement donc important parce que ce sont les incidents donc, à Koudia et Nini, où là on a un tour de vis. C'est aussi un événement fondateur pour la diaspora ouïghour, parce que là on a eu quand même un certain nombre de victimes importantes, etc. Une étape suivante qui a été très peu vue ici en Europe occidentale, mais qui à mon avis est très importante, c'est le conflit du Kosovo. Parce qu'avec le conflit du Kosovo, on voit à Pékin naître des craintes d'une configuration où vous auriez une sorte de revendication en interne qui serait appuyée par des forces extérieures. Et ça a, à mon avis, amené les autorités chinoises à de nouveau remettre l'accent sur la prévention, la sécurité du Xinjiang, la coopération avec les États d'Asie centrale, etc., toujours dans la même idée de mettre en avant la sécurité. Alors, à partir de 2001, bien sûr, vous avez le contexte de la lutte contre le terrorisme qui va considérablement aider, je dirais, les autorités chinoises à faire accepter leur discours de sécurisation au Xinjiang, donc sur la scène internationale, en s'associant à la lutte contre le terrorisme, en faisant admettre l'éthique sur la liste des mouvements terroristes, alors qu'on n'en avait même jamais entendu parler avant 2001, etc. Donc ça, c'est quelque chose qui a fortement aidé. En 2009, ce qui s'est passé à Urumqi, là, je veux dire, fournit à la fois une excuse pour renforcer les mesures de sécurité et aussi quelque part permet aux autorités de dire que son discours était correct, qu'il y avait des extrémistes au Xinjiang. Regardez, toutes ces émeutes, ce sont des radicaux, ils viennent de l'extérieur, etc. Ils ont été influencés. Et puis ces attaques de 2013-2014, dont on a parlé à Kunming, etc., de nouveau en tour de vis, et puis surtout donc l'arrivée de Chen Xuanguo et le lancement du projet Obor qui vraiment vient remettre le dernier tour de vis sur, sur cette politique sécuritaire. Donc vous voyez qu'on peut vraiment retracer toute une chronologie dès les années 89-90 jusqu'à aujourd'hui, avec toujours donc, une même ligne. Et ça me permet de conclure en 2 minutes sur ce qui, à mon avis, est aujourd'hui donc une impasse qui est constituée par un dilemme d'insécurité donc, au Xinjiang. C'est-à-dire que ce discours qui a lié donc, les Ouïghours au séparatisme, à l'extrémisme, au terrorisme, etc., les mesures qui ont été prises par le gouvernement ont à la fois donc, mis en place cette sécurité, mais insécurisé aussi complètement les Ouïghours, avec de temps en temps donc, des explosions de colère, comme on l'a vu en 2009, où là on est dans une spirale négative, parce que chaque explosion de colère, chaque incident est inscrit, je dirais, dans un discours sécuritaire, et donc permet de renforcer la sécurité et donc d'insécuriser encore un petit peu plus la minorité ouïghour qui, à un moment donné, exprime son mécontentement. Donc nous avons une spirale qui est enclenchée et qui en fait est autoréalisatrice, puisque les mesures de départ étaient quand même des mesures préventives. Donc là, le gouvernement chinois, quelque part, lui-même, créé finalement la radicalité chez certains, parce que là aussi, il faut être très très prudent. La recherche académique, en fait, a mis en avant que les stratégies donc, de résistance des Ouïghours sont surtout des stratégies de résistance infrapolitique. On résiste par le vêtement, on résistait par le fait d'aller manger dans des restaurants halal, par le fait de faire de la poésie, par le fait de faire de l'humour, des choses comme ça. Tout ça aujourd'hui est devenu même extrêmement difficile, parce qu'on est arrivé, je dirais, au sommet de cette politique sécuritaire. Alors, est-ce que dans la situation actuelle, est-ce qu'on peut sortir de cette impasse? Je pense que ça, c'est la grande question. Est-ce qu'on peut réellement sortir de cette impasse? Je vous dirais que personnellement, je ne suis pas très optimiste, parce qu'il y a une très grande surdité des autorités chinoises face aussi bien à la frustration et au vrai grief de la population ouïghour qu'aux critiques qu'elles viennent de l'international. Il y a une absence complète de remise en cause du bien fondé de la politique qui est appliquée. Au contraire, on a un discours qui consiste à dire que cette politique fonctionne très bien, puisqu'on n'a pas d'attentat soi-disant au Xinjiang depuis 2 ans, donc c'est que la politique fonctionne, donc c'est pas le moment de la remettre en cause. On n'a pas de canaux de communication réels entre, les Ouïghours et le pouvoir, même les voix les plus modérées que l'on a évoquées tout à l'heure, les collègues de Rune ou bien d'autres personnes comme Ilham Tohti par exemple, que l'on n'a pas cité, qui était quelqu'un de très modéré, est aujourd'hui en prison. Donc il n'y a pas de canaux de communication. Il faut ajouter à ça, donc vraiment pour conclure, que ce qui complique la donne, c'est qu'on a quand même une pression qui est exercée par certains rames dans la région qui ont demandé, par exemple, en 2009, d'avoir plus de mesures de sécurité. Le discours de sécurisation est accepté. On le voit, par exemple, à travers des rames qui coopèrent avec le pouvoir, sans aucun problème, on s'y tient. L'islamophobie qui s'est développée, y compris sur l'Internet en Chine. Les préjugés à l'égard des Ouïghours, qui sont tout à fait récurrents. Le contexte actuel international et interne en Chine défavorable. Au bord fait que Xi Jinping n'a certainement pas envie de changer de politique, hein, c'est ce que nous a expliqué Gladney, la personnalité forte du gouverneur Xinjiang, qui se pose en homme fort. C'est très utile aussi pour son cursus à l'intérieur du pouvoir. Donc là, évidemment, il ne faut pas compter sur lui pour changer, changer d'orientation. La radicalisation de certains Ouïghours, ils sont très peu nombreux, mais c'est très utile parce que ça donne un facteur de légitimation supplémentaire, je dirais, donc, au pouvoir, aussi bien en interne qu'à l'international, en associant justement les Ouïghours à Al-Qaïda ou à Daesh, comme on l'a vu très souvent dans les discours, et finalement le contexte international qui n'est pas non plus très propice, avec cette crainte partagée du terrorisme islamique, la proximité de très nombreux régimes avec Pékin, différentes raisons, une très faible visibilité finalement de la cause ouïghour. Donc pour conclure, je dirais que jamais sans doute les Ouïghours n'ont été aussi isolés qu'aujourd'hui et leur voix moins audible. C'est pour ça que je tenais vraiment à vous remercier de votre présence, parce qu'au moins vous l'aurez entendu aujourd'hui.